Hi everyone, it's interesting me to see how the No campaign for The Voice are actually presenting themselves these days. And one of the ways by which we can have our best look at this is to have a look at my mate, my buddy, my friend, and Andrew Bolt, because he is the one that spouts the biggest amount of crap in relation to his advocacy for the No campaign. I think it disgusts me to hear how these people talk about this. It is, whether we like it or not, it is tainted with racism and their own fears about these white people losing the power and authority that they think they deserve simply because they're white. Now, Andrew here is going to talk to you about the McCarthy Commission and what that means, and I will try and enlighten you about what the McCarthy Commission really is all about, and it's not about the sort of stuff that Bolt's talking about. So I'll just bring up that screen, and we'll have a conversation about it as we listen to this man rant and rave.
But first, the Prime Minister. He yesterday misled you. He misled Australians about his voice to Parliament and seriously misled them. Yesterday, Anthony Albanese insisted on 2BG Radio that if we vote for the voice later this year, Labor's kind of Aboriginal-only advisory parliament, it will have nothing to do with compensation.
No, Ben, I can't say it any clearer. Okay. Compensation is
Now, I find this interesting enough. Albanese is definitely saying, no, this is not what this is about. But Ben Fordham won't listen to him, as won't Andrew Bolt, as won't anybody who sits on the right.
Nothing to do with what people will vote on in the last quarter of this year.
No, I'm talking about after that.
And can I make that? Well, they're not voting on any of that.
No, I was just saying there are three stages. So after we go through the voice, is it natural to assume that as part of treaty...
No, it's not natural.
Now, that is actually completely false. It's like saying if you give someone a match, it's got nothing to do with fire.
That is the worst analogy I've ever heard of. That is, if someone... I don't know how to make this point any clearer, but, if you give someone a match and they choose to go and light a fire... There's no legislation to prevent them from doing that specifically. This is about how all of these issues will be legislated once the voice has been passed via the referendum. That is it. It is no more complicated than that. There would still be a lot of debate, a lot of discussion about many of these areas, and no one's denying that. I'm certainly not. But there is an issue in relation to how this gets interpreted, just in relation to voting for the voice, as if the voice itself and having Indigenous people recognised in our Constitution automatically means that all these other things that these dudes talk about will actually take place. That is not true.
Let me tell you why. Actually, let Thomas Mayo, who's one of the activists actually appointed by the government to design this voice, let him tell you why.
Wonderful thing about the Uluru Statement, the proposal for a voice, this is the first step. It's a vital step, and it puts all the explanation behind it. Pay the rent, for example. How do we do that in a way that is transparent and that it actually sees reparations?
Okay, Thomas Mayo, one of the architects who designed the voice, says this is going to talk about reparations, but more than that, he says it's also...
Now, there are some people who sit on, who are activists such as Thomas Mayo, who do want to seek reparations. That there's probably a really good argument for that, given the harm that we have done, that white people, colonials have done to Indigenous people. And there would be some of us, or some people on the other, like such as myself, who would think that's probably not a bad thing. But that's just a far too radical idea for people like Bolt to consider, because that he believes they'd be taking money out of his pocket. He doesn't see the social justice issues involved in that. In fact, the man has no sense of what social justice even refers to, and that he would prefer there to be no justice whatsoever for Indigenous people. And I think that we need to be mindful that there are varying views around all of this, but none of this stuff gets determined ultimately by voting in the referendum.
Albanese has said himself. And that's because this Uluru Statement that Thomas Mayer mentioned, drawn up by selected activists 6 years ago, says the Voice is part of a three-part revolution that these activists want to how this country is actually run. And the Prime Minister has actually told them he will deliver all three of their demands in full.
We rise to the moment to work with you in lifting the words off the page and lifting our whole nation up with a new spirit of partnership between government and First Nations people through the work of Makarrata, treaty making and truth telling, and by enshrining.
And I think this is the issue that concerns people like Bolt, is that we will be working together with Indigenous people to bring about justice, fairness, and to bridge the gap. That is all that we're doing. And frankly, that scares the daylights out of people such as Andrew Bolt and his cohorts on the right of politics.
Providing a voice to Parliament in our Constitution.
Now, those three interlocking parts of this revolution, as you just heard, are the Voice, this kind of Aboriginal Parliament we're about to vote on.
They are three separate issues. They are not interlocking. They will follow one from the other, but it doesn't mean that they're interlocking. The processes for each one of these will be different. The Voice is simply a referendum. What happens after that and the legislation required and all that sort of stuff is a whole different debate. So to conflate the two, as Bolt does, is so disingenuous and is completely dishonest.
That's coming first. Second, truth-telling, essentially a propaganda campaign. And the third is this Makarrata, an organisation to negotiate a treaty between Aborigines and the rest of us, which will inevitably include compensation.
Notice the language, between Indigenous people and the rest of us. And the rest of us. So there's this notion that there's us and them, as opposed to us offering a helping hand, offering the opportunity, I guess, for Indigenous people to do their truth telling in their way, in their cultural way, so that Parliament, which consists now of a lot of Indigenous people itself, can take note of those things that they have to say. But he wants to divide us. The language he uses is a strong indicator that all he wants to do is to divide us.
Compensation is part of this settlement of a war that I can't see, but they've invented. I repeat, this is all part of the government's real agenda, Albanese's real agenda. So all linked, even if Albanese is now pretending it isn't. Now, in fact, Anthony Albanese, a couple of months ago, said himself that one of the jobs of this Voice is going to indeed be to talk about the Makarrata and making a treaty.
One of the things that a Voice to Parliament will be able to do is to talk about Makarrata, the need for agreement making and coming together after a conflict.
And even more than that, Albanese has already started to create that Makarrata Commission, putting it in place. His government has already handed out nearly $900,000 of your money to set up this Makarrata, to start working out a treaty and the inevitable compensation it might want. It's happening, folks. And you can just look in Victoria, because there's a warning for you. Victoria's already exactly down the same path, with exactly the results I'm warning about. And then Albanese said, oh, no, nothing to see here, folks. Victoria has set up its own First Nations Assembly, its own voice, its own kind of advisory parliament of people identifying as Aboriginal, although this version of the voice is not in any constitution, so it has less power, thank God for that. But what has this Victorian voice already done? It's got a bunch of directors of something called the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria's Self-Determination Fund.
Oh, how terrible. How terrible that the Victorian government have set up a group of Indigenous people to advise their government. Now, I don't see what this has got to do with, repatriation or reparation, rather. I don't understand that because he doesn't highlight any of that. But this is definitely part of the scare campaign of the right wing and really needs to be called out for what it is.
Which it says has just got $35 million from the Victorian government to again help prepare negotiations over a treaty. Get the voice, you get the treaty, right? And the leaders of this First Peoples Assembly in Victoria, they gave an interview saying, yes, and here's the big surprise, folks, reparations or redress could form part of a truth-telling process. Well, I think we can...
Now, even though there is, as I said before, there is an argument for redress or reparation, and there'll be many of us who would agree with that. What actually that looks like, how that will be presented, will become a completely different issue. And it isn't the way, like there was this scare campaign when Mabo was being hammered out. And it was believed that for whatever reason, Indigenous people would wind up taking over our backyards and taking over the land that we've purchased or whatever. None of that ever happened, clearly, because it wasn't part of the arrangement by any stretch of the imagination. But here they are again, conflating the notion of treaty, repatriation, Makarrata Commission, and what that means in terms of what it is that us white people or the other people that are non-Indigenous, what it is that we will lose. And this is the greatest fear that the right have, is that somehow they believe that we will lose something to this minority group who to them means nothing. The Indigenous people to them are inconsequential. They are insignificant. They are lesser than. And this is what drives the No campaign and people like Bolt to talk about it in the way that they do.
Will. Reparations are involved. So no, Prime Minister, you are wrong. A vote for the voice is a vote for your grand scheme, the whole package. The voice to start with, as you said, then the Makarrata Commission, as you said, the one you're already spending money on to set up, and then the ultimate aim, the treaty and that compensation, that money.
So at the end of the day, these dudes, the guys on the right, are primarily fearful that money will be taken from us white people and others, to pay Indigenous people for the harm that we have inflicted upon them. And personally, I don't see anything wrong with that at all. To me, it's no different than, people that were sexually abused while in state care, that they should receive some sort of payment as a result of that. And we accepted that, and the Royal Commission on Sexual Abuse and Institutionalised Care came out and said, this is what we suggest you do in terms of reparation for the abuse that was inflicted upon you. And here we have a whole group of people culturally who have also been abused by us, continue to be abused by us. But people like Andrew Bolt and others are fearful that they actually might be called out for their own racism. and that they're trying to build a wall around themselves that will protect them from whatever it is they believe should happen to them. In other words, them being called out and what that means to them, because they don't want to admit to their own degree of racism. And it's absolutely, absolutely appalling. So let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. Subscribe to my channel and let us know what you think about The Voice, where you stand on that. And if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask or any further comments that you please make them below. So thanks everybody for being with me. Take care, look after yourselves, and more importantly, be safe.